The timeline is the area where you can adjust any assets in the selected composition. The timeline is located at the bottom of the screen. This is where you bring in your assets into your scene, your images, your videos, music. They're brought into your timeline where you can adjust their lengths and their speeds. There's a fair few features on the timeline, but for this video we're going to go over the bare necessities. Let's import a piece of footage. I'm going to go File, Import Files, Video, and I'm just going to select a random video. Okay, here's a nice video of a lake. So when we've imported a piece of footage, which we can do by going File, Import like we just did, or by going to the piece of footage in the folder and dragging it into the project, we can then drag our footage down here into this side, right hand side, into the timeline. As you can see, this blue bar has appeared in the timeline. This is the piece of footage, and if by clicking the footage, left click with the mouse, we can drag the footage to the start of the timeline. If we press spacebar, we begin to play the footage in the timeline. Notice there's a green bar increasing across the timeline. This is the render bar. When we import new footage into the timeline, the render bar will be grey, and when we press spacebar, it will render the timeline. As more clips are added, the timeline will need to be re-rendered each time. So the first time you press spacebar to play your footage, the timeline might appear a little bit choppy whilst it renders. Let's have a look at some of these features on the timeline. The first noticeable feature is the time itself. So you can see that we've got the numbers here for 1 second or 15 frames. So the breakdown here gives you frames and seconds. We're at 29.97 frames per second, which is about 30. So 15 frames is essentially half a second. So you can see on the timeline whether we're 1 second, 2 seconds, 2.5 seconds, which is indicated by 2 seconds and 15 frames. If we go just down to the bottom of the screen, you can see that we've got this zoom bar, which allows us to zoom in and out closer to the frames on the timeline. Now we're zoomed in, we can get much more selective with exactly which frame we want to land on. We can literally drag frame by frame, and there's quite a lot of space so that we can be very accurate. The more we zoom out, the more time will be covered, and obviously the harder it'll be to get bang on the frame we want. So sometimes you may want to use this to zoom in and select your frame properly. Over on the left side of the timeline, you can see the top, we've got this icon which shows the composition that we're in, the time that we're at, there's a search menu, and there's a few switches and toggles at the top. We won't cover all of these in extreme detail. Later on we will cover the graph editor, motion blur, maybe touch on the Shy Guy. These, however, should be noted early on. So these small icons on the left are actually pretty important. So if we press the I is going to hide our layer. If we press the I again, the I is going to solo our layer. I'm going to just put some text into the screen quickly. Now I'm just going to align to the center. You don't have to do this now. You can just follow along just to see how these switches work. So if we press the solo icon next to text or lake, it'll just show us that layer. So if we had 10 layers in here and we wanted to just see what one layer was doing, we can just solo the layer and it'll hide all the other layers. You can color code your layers. Red for text, maybe you want peach, or maybe you want dark green for compositions. Then you've got the layer name. The Shy Guy here, we won't worry too much about that. This hides layers within the timeline. So when we've got the shy guy on, we can actually hide these layers, but we don't need to worry about that. We probably won't do that too much throughout this course. There's motion blur, which actually we do use a lot. So motion blur adds a bit of blur to anything moving in the timeline, but we need to make sure the master motion blur switch is on as well. So motion blur takes a bit more time to render, so the reason the master switch is there is so that you can set motion blur on everything you like, but you don't have to have it enabled to speed up rendering whilst you're working on your project. Adjustment layer effect and 3D layer, we can select these to make it 3D. If we select the boxes, the mode is the blending mode, which is just like in Photoshop, is how much light's being let through. We'll touch on those a little bit later. There's a transparency icon, track matte, and parent and link. For now, let's not worry too much about these. Just remember these icons on the left. Also, just missed one there. If you want to lock this background so that you can't accidentally move it, you can't accidentally select it, just press the lock. If we unlock it now, you can see we can move it. So if you don't want to be able to move it, you can press the lock button. Here are a few essential shortcuts I like to use when controlling the timeline. If we select a layer, first of all, if you drag the layer, this is going to drag where the layer starts and where the layer ends. If this happens, you just press caps lock to disable caps lock when you get that error message on the screen. If you drag the end of your layer, you can make the layer shorter. This layer is locked, so we can make the layer shorter. It doesn't actually make the layer shorter, but it moves the start of the layer forward. So it's not going to start from the start if you do cut it down this way. If you want to actually move it forward in time, you drag the layer by clicking on it, but if you click the end of the layer and drag it up, it actually cuts away the start of the scene. So we just click to drag around, and make sure to click off in any grey space in the timeline if you want to deselect. So Control and D duplicates a layer. This is a very useful shortcut to know. If we click a layer here, say our text layer, and press Control and D, you can see we've duplicated a layer, and Control and Z undoes anything that we've just done. Control Shift and D will cut the layer and move it to a layer above, move the second half to the layer above, or split the layer. That's Control Shift and D. To trim the layer, we can click anywhere on the timeline. Let's go to 1 second and press Alt and left bracket to trim the start. Let's move forward by dragging the timeline indicator, that's the blue arrow up here. We can trim the right side of a layer by pressing Alt and the right bracket. Finally, if we copy anything, any effects from one layer, we press Control and V to paste the layer. This also works if we've copied a layer with Control and C. We can press Control and V to paste the layer. Finally, with our composition selected, if we've made arrangements to our layers and we decide that we want the composition to start here, we can drag the work area across and hold Shift to snap it to the start. And similarly, if we drag to 6 seconds, we can right click and trim comp to work area, and that trims the composition down so that we have a 6-second composition. And that covers pretty much everything that we need to know for now in the timeline, and we will pick up new things as we go along.